Chapter 1301. Culture. Silas stepped out of the tower, his expression still quite calm. He didn't know what happened or why it happened, but he chose to throw it to the back of his mind. The moment he exited, he was buffeted by the sweetest of winds. It wasn't from a bakery or anything, but instead that the nature here was just so refreshing. Maybe it was because he was used to city life on Earth, but this felt different. Of course, he had been through the trial where he was thrust into the middle of nature. But this still felt different from that. It was like Earth was still healing from scars others had left on it, even to the point its ether plane suffered as well. But this world felt whole. It felt like it was allowed to grow and flourish the way things were always meant to. And it felt like a gardener had been carefully pruning it all along, ensuring it remained perfect and whole. There was a flash before Silas' eyes as he was enjoying the flourishing scenery, and Grelith appeared. He nodded calmly and a platform appeared beneath the both of them. Here. As they soared through the skies, Grelith handed Silas the rulebook he had been asking for. The reason he couldn't have it before was because, according to the rules, until he became an official disciple, he couldn't. As for why they had such a rule for a rule book of all things, well, it was one of those things decided by those long dead that they continued to follow anyway. Maybe that was what the core sanctum warlord had meant when he spoke of breaking rules. Silas didn't say much and just cracked the booklet open. Instead of finding words, though, he found a series of runes that flashed before his eyes in a maze of twisting complexities. They were simple enough, but... Silas' eyes narrowed. This was odd. He felt something unique from this rule book. They were definitely only simple runes, and the rules themselves were clear enough. So much so that Silas saw through them in a single glance. But there was something more, something deeper. Silas almost slapped the book closed, his mind whirring with a series of thoughts. And then he opened it again, got the same feeling, and then snapped it closed again. Grelith gave Silas a glance back, wondering what was happening. Sure, he expected Silas to be fast, just not that fast. But when he thought that Silas was done, he opened the booklet again. And then closed it again. What was he doing? Are all of these rule books the same? Silas asked. They should be, Grelith replied slowly. Do you have another? Grelith thought for a moment and then took another one out. He had a few, actually. Not for any particular reason, it was just that the rule books were commonplace throughout the sanctum. If you spent enough time around this organization, you were bound to pick up more than one at some point. Silas took the second rule book and flipped it open. The same, but different. Can I see all the ones you have? Grelith handed them over. There were 12 of them. Some he had simply because he was the Scorpion warlord who had disciples to teach. Others he couldn't even bother to recall how he had picked them up. Silas flipped through them all, his eyes glowing brighter and brighter every time. Each one was just the slightest bit different, as though they had been imprinted by a unique fingerprint along the way. It didn't just feel like it was the fault of the one that had the booklet at the time, but it also carried forth all those that had come before it too. This wasn't just a rule book. It was culture. Silas whispered the word. If you kept this rule book on your person, or you read it even once, it influenced you in a unique sort of way. It didn't just ingrain the rules into you, but the spirit of the rules themselves. The thing was, though, that these rules seemed to be ever-flowing, ever-changing. It wasn't that the rules themselves were rewritten, but instead that the intent, the core of the meaning behind it, the truth of it all, was constantly being redrawn by future generations. Always changing, always shifting, and yet the same nonetheless. So long as the core, underlying principles remained, everything would likewise continue to be the same as well. But how could runes meant to do little more than relay words in the most easily contained and digestible way possible coalesce together to form something greater than that? And how could you change these runes, and yet have them continue to convey nearly the same meaning? A spark. Silas' eyes glowed with a fierce light. This sort of sameness, and yet fluidity, but rigid guidelines, and yet accepting to change. That was it. He was thinking of spark mastery in such rigid terms. But if he created a seed, he would be locking it into one path. If he created a new wool around it, he would also be locking it into one path. Rune mastery wasn't ever meant to be so constrained in the first place. It was something designed to be a reflection of the world. There were so many languages, so many different methods of conveying the same things, but the universe ultimately only had one way of communicating. So why was it that everyone else had distilled things into so many avenues? That answer, Silas didn't have quite yet. But he had a clue. Humanity versus demons. Two different paths, two different complete languages, two directions that couldn't have been more different from one another. Culture. That was what he needed to instill into his runes. The next step felt so logical. Not long ago, he had managed to sense emotions from his runes, and it took his casting to a completely new level. Now, his runes felt like a group of unruly children that all wanted to go down their own paths. That was why he had thought of following a more rigid path. But that wasn't necessary. All he needed to do was put some soft guardrails. And then, Silas' eyes flashed with a blinding emerald light. Chapter 1302. Reality. Silas' eyes pulsed unwittingly. He was so focused that he was no longer reigning in his runeweaver eyes, while the runes around him were responding in kind. It was like the world itself was being weaved in and out of existence, one tile after another being pieced together to create the most beautiful of tapestries before unraveling itself just moments later. There was a spontaneity to it that Silas couldn't explain. It was like the runes around him were coming together of their own volition, almost like a child playing around with Lego blocks. Legos. Silas remembered just how much he loved them as a child. He had already grown bored of their mass-produced puzzles by the time he was 2 or 3 years old, so he remembered taking up the task of crafting puzzles of his own. That day Legacy put him in that white room, he almost reached for the Lego pieces to craft something of his own again, before the twine and cork board caught his attention instead. He had grown out of that phase eventually too, feeling that it had become too easy to create what he wanted. There were only so many self-created engines, and cities, and trains that he could make. And eventually, when he had forged enough of one kind, it was all too easy to extrapolate it into others. It had become monotony by a different name. Silas couldn't remember feeling disappointed about that. In fact, he had instead felt that it was oh so very complete. It was only natural that he reached such a state of perfection because he was Silas Brown. Silas Grimblade. A different name, but just the same person. And now he was feeling that feeling again, like he was closing in on completion, like it was whispering into his ears. But then came the sudden roar. It formed out of nowhere, attacking Silas' mind with menace. 12 crimson eyes stared back at him from the depths of an abyss, the very crevices of death and the end itself. Silas felt his mind shatter and his heart combust. A will buried deep within him rushed out in a wave. Pucchi. Grelith had been watching Silas from the very start, not entirely sure of what was happening, but feeling like everything was about to change nonetheless. And then it happened. A hook, rusted with blood and reflecting with ominous greed. It pierced right through Silas' chest, and yet it also seemed to manifest from Silas as well. It wiggled about somehow both like a symbiotic parasite, and yet also killing Silas right before Grelith's very eyes. The 713th Scorpion Warlord was shocked, but Silas was even more shocked as he felt his life fading away from him. He tried to grasp it, but nothing he did seemed to work. It was like he had crossed over a taboo and there was suddenly no returning. But they both had the same thought at the same time. Scorpion. Tail. Silas' confusion remained just the same, but the reality slammed into Grelith like a ton of bricks. Reality and realization. Hold on or you really will die, Grelith said with more emotion than Silas had ever seen from him. No, he had seen this level of emotion once before. The tone wasn't fawning or laced with anxiety. Instead, it was stern and pulsing with rage and fury. Just like the moment he made Silas stop questioning the issues with the Scorpion Warlord armor. Taking Silas by the shoulder, Grelith's speed suddenly accelerated. He moved faster than Silas had ever seen a person move. If not for the fact he was being forced on as a tagalong, Silas wasn't even confident in tracking this sort of speed at all. Space bent and warped not out of some sort of ability, but out of raw power instead. This sort of speed alone would be capable of shredding Silas to pieces, he was sure, if not for the fact Grelith was protecting him with his abilities. It was only at that moment that Silas truly understood how powerful a C tier was. Maybe it was because of the name, or because he had grown so used to fighting above his tier, but Silas had subconsciously dismissed them. It was hard to take a C tier seriously when he knew there had to logically be a B- and an A tier above it. The fact he had a Kingslayer title only made it more difficult. But seeing Grelith almost casually pull out such speed, and over such a long distance and so consistently, seemingly without even relying on a real skill, gene, or technique, it put things into perspective. A C tier could wipe out Earth with a wave of their hand if they so chose. The C tier was a realm of real powerhouses. Of gods. Bang! Grelith landed heavily at the bottom of a set of stairs so golden they beamed away the sunlight, nearly blinding the eyes. He looked towards Silas to find that other than a clenched jaw, it was hard to tell that the man was injured at all. Well, if you ignored the illusory black scorpion stinger coming out of him. Grelith tried to take a step forward but his body shook as he was sent back a step, and then another. Though he tried to restrain it, a mouthful of blood came from his lips as he coughed, his body shuddering. Undeterred, he protected Silas to his back and tried to take another step, but the result was just the same. Even after a third and a fourth attempt, he failed to even take the first step, let alone the hundreds that came following it. Silas didn't even know what to make of this scene. Was he supposed to hold on while Grelith never seemed to take even the first step? He had been trying to think of solutions all the while, but he only felt that he knew one thing for certain. Whatever enlightenment he had just had almost caused him to fix the issue with the Scorpion Warlord armor. And the Scorpion did not like that. Now, he was being punished for it. How dare you? Silas' true pride seed growled in defiance. But defiance was one thing. Reality was another. Chapter 1303. Fix. Silas looked down at the scorpion tail coming out of him. Veins of black and dark violet had begun to practically ooze outward from beneath his skin. Whatever thick, vicious liquid it was seemed to use his heart as a pump, plowing it through and eviscerating his blood. It was poison in the truest sense, a raging inferno of cancerous menace looking to eat into everything in its path. Silas could feel it, that rage that didn't quite feel like rage, but more like madness. Madness in the truest sense, as though the scorpion had lost its sense of self, or maybe that in battle, it had never had one. Its only goal was to take down its opponent at any cost. There was no running, no hiding, no attempt at escape. It didn't want any of that. It wanted carnage. This was the true path of the Scorpion. Earth escape. How could the Scorpion Emperor ever take such a path for itself? It would rather die on the battlefield, cut from limb to limb, its organs hanging out in a chorus of flesh and blood, its body an unrecognizable stew of steaming resentment and what ravaged remains it managed to claw from its enemies. It didn't want anything else for itself. It didn't want a day without battle, without the constant edge of life and death chiseling its blade and using its soul as a whetstone. It didn't want anyone else touching even the faintest edges of its true self either. It was a creature that preferred its solitude, its seclusion, to bury itself in the sands and allow the scorching heat to lick its wounds closed as it waited for its next prey. It wasn't a matter of honor. A scorpion had no honor. It didn't care to stab you in the back or claw out the heart of its own brother. It was a matter of its nature, a savage desire for blood that sunk deep into its bones. It was what nature had made it. A feral creature, knowing not of peace or calm. Collaboration wasn't what it did. However, Silas wasn't convinced that this was why it was lashing out at him. There were any number of creatures that would act similarly. The lion, there could only be one in a pack of lionesses, even to the point of infanticide to wipe out the lineage of any previous lions who ruled. Why was it that the lion lineage didn't face the same hardship? Was their warlord armor also incomplete in the same way? Would they also be attacked should they perfect it? And that was just one creature. There were so many others. This, though, it felt different. It was as though this creature had been waiting for someone, anyone, to overstep such a line, to make such a mistake, as though the root mistake was weaved into the warlord armor itself. Silas' eyes flashed. In that moment, he ignored the world around him, not even feeling Grelith's hand on his shoulder. Grelith, who was already on his 7th attempt in trying to walk up those wide set of golden stairs, felt his heart skip a beat as he looked back. Silas seemed to have passed out, the poison beginning to spread over him. The veins of black and dark violet had already crawled up his neck and were quickly making their way to his brain. If his body was in this state, his will was almost surely in a worse state. However, Grelith was wrong. Silas will had hardly been touched. Instead, there seemed to be a standoff of some sort in the deep layers of his body, hidden away where the will core was meant to be. It was simply too sturdy. Silas was being attacked by backlash from the F-grade Scorpion Warlord armor. Unfortunately for it, he had enlightened will, something that was entirely unheard of at the F-grade. And that was before even mentioning the fact he had demonic will and his true pride seed on top of that. His true pride seed's presence alone was practically like an infinitely thick barrier it couldn't hope to make it through. It was just that even if his will managed to hold on, if his brain died, the rest of his body would go with it. Then his will would just be a crystal without a home. At that point, it would just be a matter of time before Silas himself dissipated away. But even those thoughts had been thrown out of Silas' mind as he focused on one thing. The Scorpion Warlord armor and its runes. It was odd. When he was attacked just now, he hadn't even tried to summon the armor, he had just thought of something that might complete it. So where had the attack come from? It was just as he had said. He had too many wills inside of him. Aside from his own, he had aspects of the giant apes, the serpentis, and the scorpion. All of them should be clashing and coming to a head. Even now, Silas would have trouble using fusion and his warlord armor at the same time. The only reason he could even think about doing this now was because his profession had evolved, but the two clashing wills would weaken them both in kind and he had yet to properly resolve this. Though, he felt that his recent Spark Mastery breakthrough might allow him to take this step forward. Unfortunately, before he could, this backlash almost took him out. This was all to say that the backlash itself had once again come from that hidden will. This wasn't a surprise. In order to affect his stats directly, the Scorpion Warlord armor had to interact with his body on a very deep level. But that was where the core of it all started. In a flashing instant of time, Silas had gone through the entire Scorpion Warlord armor and found the root cause of it all. Interesting. Fix it, then. Bang. Chapter 1304. 713th Scorpion Warlord. The Scorpion Emperor's tail began to writhe with more wild abandon, as though it sensed what Silas was trying to do. The poison spread even faster, and Grelith almost pulled his hand back as he sensed a great amount of danger. But the 713th Scorpion Warlord quickly realized that it was nothing more than an illusion, as though something was being projected onto him and his mind. This poison, as powerful as it seemed, was only F-grade. It was excellent, but it would be crushed before it could even penetrate his skin. But what powerful will! His breathing became slightly heavy. He had come to realize from the reaction of the scorpion's tail and the oozing black blood falling from Silas' body that Silas hadn't passed out at all. He was trying something. It was quite typical of Silas. There was no way that he would just stand and wait here hoping that Grelith would protect him. Silas had probably never once referred to Grelith as his master in his mind. At best, Grelith bet he got his first name. In terms of true master-disciple relationships, what should have been akin to a parent and child, they had none of that, and Grelith doubted they ever would. Silas was a person who seemed to have very limited bandwidth for those he loved, and he had probably not added a new person into that itinerary since the moment he matured enough to stop playing with Legos. However, as similar as they seemed to be on the surface, it didn't mean that Grelith was the same. Alright, then. He took a breath and exhaled. Boom. A warlord armor manifested onto Grelith's body and the planet shook. As though he carried the heft of a world on his shoulders, shingles of black, red, and violet pieced together with sounds akin to meteors crashing against one another. His hair danced in the wind, his own scorpion tail rising into the air and then piercing forward. It grew out like a whipping chain, its segments disconnecting. One of the prerequisites for becoming a warlord was to change your armor in some way. It was something only the best of rune masters of the sanctum could do, tweaking an armor that had existed for countless years. One of the 713th Scorpion Warlord's most famous additions was the chain tail. It extended the scope and range of the scorpion tail by several magnitudes, not to mention adding a shocking amount of flexibility. But if one looked closely, not only was Grelith's warlord armor of a far different stock than the others, but his skin was actually beginning to corrode beneath its own might. He coughed out a misty breath of blood, veins of red pooling down from the corners of his eyes, but his power skyrocketed nonetheless. All at once, senses from all across the sanctum seemed to gather toward the location. It seemed that it was only now they realized what was happening. However, Grelith hadn't called them for help for a reason. His mind pulsed and his will steeled, gathering as if forming shingles of its own. And then, he took a step forward. Boom, boom, boom. His foot landed on the first step, the sounds akin to crashing meteors and moons slamming into one another reverberating not from the stairs themselves, but from the inside of Grelith's body. He unleashed a roar, one shingle of scorpion armor after another combusting before quickly reforming. The veins of red flowed even further down the length of his face and down his neck as he raised up a second step. Boom. His bones fired like rockets, their fracturing cadence sending out radiant pulses. The amount of power they held was so strong that even these minor fissures released an energy that could have toppled a mountain on Earth. If not for the sturdiness of the sanctum, mountains would have collapsed here too. Boom. A third step, and then a fourth. Grelith was moving slowly, withstanding the pressure weighing down on both himself and Silas. What are you doing? The voice seemed to come from nowhere and yet everywhere at once. It didn't sound angry, or even all that questioning for that matter, but Grelith wasn't in a position to answer, and maybe that truth alone was enough to prove the real purpose of the voice. It didn't want anyone but those already chosen to climb these steps. However, Grelith wasn't one to sit idly by and listen. With a roar, he took his fifth step. You struggle so much on just the fifth, and yet there are 661 left to go. Do you really think you'll make it to the top? What are you trying to do, exactly? Boom. Grelith's leg shattered as he took the sixth step. All of the shingles protecting it caved, wisps of black, red, and violet spiraling out in all directions and taking his flesh with it. A bone barely attached to a foot appeared, radiating a black that didn't seem healthy in the slightest. Grelith's eyes flashed as he looked down at his leg, but his expression didn't seem to be one of pain, though maybe it was hard to tell with the veins running across his face. The answer became clear a moment later, though, when a wild grin spread across his lips. It looked almost as though he had lost his mind, his lips spreading out much further than the supposed human he was. His canines grew, his violet eyes reflecting one complex rune after another as though to suppress his violent tendencies. And yet, they snapped like chains, one after another. He howled, taking another step. Boom. His other leg shattered, a bone of black and obsidian being all that remained. A waste. The voice said indifferently. But at that moment, Silas suddenly opened his eyes, a violent rush coming out of him before his hair descended to the small of his back in a calm descent. Thank you, Silas said. Clearly, he wasn't speaking to the voice. Boom. Chapter 1305. A tale as old as time. Silas had been completely surrounded by the aura of a scorpion, the true, unbridled nature of one, from the moment Grelith began. It was much clearer to him than the attack on his will core had been, before one was separate from him while the other was ironically trying to protect him. The dichotomy of the two, not to mention the sheer strength of the latter, made it far easier for him to grasp what was happening. Silas was already quite confident in doing it on his own, but doing it before his body gave out, well, that was another matter entirely. As powerful as the Scorpion Emperor was, it was still less powerful than the incomplete Scorpion Emperor that Grelith seemed to harbor. However, Grelith didn't seem to have heard Silas at all, even as the scorpion tail was restrained by Silas, pressing back into his body, and the poison was forced into a retreat. Grelith had still taken the eighth step. His torso exploded. Silas' eyes narrowed, understanding what was happening. Will wasn't something you could just turn on and off whenever you wanted. Grelith had made these steps his enemy, and as a scorpion warlord, he couldn't back down. Without having Grelith tell him the full story, Silas had already picked up on some of it. There was definitely a great danger involved in trying to complete the Scorpion Warlord armor the way it should be used. From what he could see, Grelith had taken a step toward doing that. Unfortunately, Silas couldn't even begin to analyze the complexities of the C-tier version of this armor. His potential at the F-tier might be far beyond Grelith's own, but as of right now, there was no doubt who between the two of them was the superior rune master. So, the best Silas could do was guess. But that left him in a troubling situation. These steps would kill him. Whatever they were far beyond him too. But he also couldn't just snap Grelith out of it. If it was that easy, it wouldn't be a C tier in Graindwell, now would it? Would he just have to stand here until Grelith died, waiting to follow him too? You awoke. The voice spoke again, but this time, there was some true emotion within it. Surprise. Shock. They were as clear as day. Silas looked up, his body completely under Grelith's control as he tried to take another step forward. However, he couldn't find the source of the voice. You really are, you. The voice spoke again, its shock even more evident as though it hadn't believed its senses the first time. Impossible, the Emperor Armor can't be born in this tiny corner of the world. Emperor Armor, Silas' eyes flashed. Suddenly a series of deductions fell into place for Silas one after another. Quote ellipsis, is that so? Silas looked toward Grelith's back. Stop. A bristling aura came from Silas, but it still didn't work. Grelith was shaking as he tried to take another step, his eighth having torn a crevice through his torso. Am I wrong? No, I'm not wrong, it's that. Silas closed his eyes again. Clang. One after another, shingles of armor slammed into place. Not good enough. 72%. Impossible. The voice boomed and Silas ignored it completely. He realized that if he wanted this to work, he needed to integrate his Scorpion Warlord unique gene first. No. His Scorpion Emperor unique gene. But he refused to do that before his armor was perfect. Unfortunately, despite his breakthrough, his Emperor armor had actually regressed. That was because he had to break it apart and reform it, getting rid of the weaknesses. It was surprisingly easy with Grelith's help. If he tried to form the Scorpion Warlord armor right now, it would undoubtedly be at 100%. He couldn't have been more confident in that. But that was no longer his path. He was taking another, even if that supposedly meant pissing off quite a great deal of people. It was a tale as old as time, a division between nobles and common people, of emperors and their subjects. How could an emperor give his people the same power as himself? Of course, they would have to have a muted version, a kernel of power that acted as both the carrot and the stick. It would give their subjects power and the chains that bound them at the same time. Silas wasn't one to be chained. He drew the Emperor armor again. 85%. He leapt into Spark Mastery in just 2 bounds. Boom. Grelith was almost flung off the stairs as he took another step. Silas felt his body shake, blood leaking from his lips. He wasn't in the best condition to begin with. The poison no longer affected him, but he had still suffered the damage from it, not to mention the fact his heart and lungs were still a crumpled mess right now. He was only alive due to his powerful will and nothing else. Any other F tier would have long died by now. But rather than diverting his will to keeping his body alive, he was focusing all of it on building this armor. He drew it again. 89%. He clenched his jaw, feeling himself slow down. If he just had a week, or if he could bring out Andromeda, he knew that he could do it. But Silas' gaze became even more focused. He pulled temporal delay as hard as he dared, slowing down his perception of the world and accelerating his speed of thought several times over. Again. He couldn't let Grelith take another step. That last one had almost killed them both. He had to be faster. 91%. Not good enough. He had already given up his foundation once before. He refused to integrate the unique gene until he brought out the best he had. His true pride seed flared, roaring through his veins. Again. 92%. Grelith's leg was already raising as Silas shattered the armor once again. Next at 2000. Chapter 1306. Be strong, be all-knowing. Silas pushed his mind as far and as hard as he could. The world had slowed down around him by a factor of dozens, and his new rune spark mastery made drawing runes feel as though he was painting onto the world directly with his mind. It was like the world wasn't just responding to flashing images in his thoughts, but the intent behind them as well, the underlying intricacies and subtle meanings that every word, emotion, and expression carried. It felt like he was communicating to the world in a language far more profound than ancient Ithkal, a language far more pronounced and perfect than even Gogo's ancestors. And that was because it wasn't a language at all. It came from the heart, the soul, his own personal spark seed. And yet it still wasn't enough. Not even remotely. There wasn't enough time. 92.5%. Another person would have already been cursing up a storm. In fact, even Silas would be if he wasn't a strictly rational person. He knew that if he spent any time at all on anything other than drawing the next rune, he would be ruining himself. He didn't even make it to 93% this time. He had already slowed the world down to a crawl. He was drawing every rune meticulously with that lagging speed. And yet it still wasn't enough. Trying to form all 3 layers was too difficult. This was also a rune armor no one had ever taught or guided him in. He was flying completely blind, and even if Grelith wasn't so focused on his suicidal task, there was nothing at all he could do to guide him either. However, he didn't have the luxury of forming one layer after the next, and he had already pushed his temporal delay progenitor flame to the very limit. Although he could push it further, if he did so he would be taking up the mental space he needed in order to actually draw the runes. His wisdom had been increased by plus 1000%, but even that was just a finite number powered by an F-tier foundation. There was only so far that he could take it, and Silas' mind flashed. In a corner of his thoughts, the one place he had left free in case he thought of a better approach, a new idea sprouted. 99% of his mind was entirely focused on pushing temporal delay as far as he could and drawing the Scorpion Emperor armor again and again. And yet, it took him 3 attempts before he finally made it to 93%, not from 92%, but from 92.5%. The progress was actually shockingly fast. The voice had been commenting as though it had well and truly lost its mind from the very start, and it seemed as though there was something particularly almost feral or off-base about it, as though it had been slowly losing its mind for a long time. But Silas wasn't paying attention to this. All at once, he abandoned drawing the Scorpion Emperor armor, turning his attention to a memory instead. His mind mentally replayed his battle with Castiel once, then twice, then thrice. He had found what he needed after the first time, but he had made doubly sure afterward. He refused to waste time and go back again. He sensed every little bit of it, the way he moved his ether, the way he drew his runes. And then he began to calculate, restructuring what he saw. It was difficult. That was because Silas was first comprehending the Rhino Warlord armor, and then he was deducing what pieces of it were different from what was part of the original armor. And those, faulty, pieces were exactly the skill he was looking for. The skill that allowed Castiel to pause in drawing his armor, allowing him to draw it piece by perfect piece. Silas hadn't been able to do this before, but at the moment, he felt like all F-tier runes were at his beck and call, following the cadence of his breath as evenly as the beating of his heart. Maybe in his entire life, he had well and truly never been so focused, so dead set on a single pursuit. Suspended stroke. The name of the technique practically roared in Silas' mind as he comprehended it, its runes dancing in his mind as though they had formed their own personal little corner. Not good enough. He took the technique as a foundation, feeling out the runes inside of it until he found exactly what he was looking for. He was right, although a minor part of it, there was some aspects of suspended stroke that used concepts from time runes. However, they weren't a major part. Though they were key in the foundation, they made up maybe 1 or 2% of the mesh of runes. However, Silas immediately grasped them, drawing them again and again until Spark Mastery, 85%, 92%, 97%, 98%, 99%, 100%. Silas never thought that the second rune he would draw to such perfection would be an insignificant corner of a technique practically everyone in the sanctum could use, but he didn't care. As Grelith's leg began to descend toward the next step, he activated Suspended Stroke, beginning to draw out his Scorpion Emperor armor once again. This time, it was like he could wheel his armor forward in progress and back as he pleased, erasing, undoing, and then moving forward again. He seemed to have forgotten the world, forgotten Grelith's descending foot. He didn't smell death at all. He would succeed, he would always succeed. He was Silas Grimblade, he would always find a path to victory. Be strong. Be all-knowing. The words reverberated in his mind again and again as he completed the first layer. And then the second layer. And then the third layer just as Grelith's foot was about to touch the step. Stop, Silas snapped out before he saw his completion percentage, roaring to Grelith at the top of his lungs. Grelith's foot touched the step. 99% mastery. Silas had sent the unique gene to fuse to him if he hit 100%. Unfortunately, he didn't. Boom. Chapter 1307, Gene Detected. The world rocked, and Silas felt as though his entire body had been thrown into chaos. Not good. It was the one thought he seemed capable of having at all. In this sort of situation, pain wasn't something to avoid. In fact, it was something he hoped to feel. If he could feel pain, it meant his body was still there, it was still intact, he could still feel and experience what it meant to be alive. If all he could feel was chaos, was there even a body of his own remaining at all? Was he still alive? He couldn't see, he couldn't breathe, he couldn't even feel. It was like he had already been blasted to smithereens, nothing remaining of himself outside of the will he was so proud of, a will that was so powerful that he would get the privilege of experiencing the last moments of his life. I failed. The realization slammed into him and seemed to come with the wave of pain he had been hoping for. But it wasn't the pain of his body, it was the pain of inadequacy, that feeling of helplessness that he tried to avoid so much, to grow beyond. It was like he was standing in that damned volcano again, the one memory that refused to stop haunting him. Every time he thought he got rid of it, it came back stronger and faster, more vicious and cancerous than before. He had been so confident. He was right there. Even until the last moment, he didn't waver. And yet, when he thought he was going to reach the 100% mastery he was chasing after, he failed. The irony, he knew exactly why that was. What was even more ironic than that? It wasn't something that he could have understood before he finished the last stroke. The essence of the scorpion was sacrifice. Could there be happiness without sadness? Hatred without love? Bravery without fear? Did he really understand the essence of sacrifice if he never thought he would fail in the first place? If he was so confident in his win every time, how could he perfectly mesh with the scorpion? Fury began to build up within Silas's chest, overwhelming the pain that was aching in his very will. Why should he have to die if he was strong enough? Why should he have to give up anything he desired or deserved? If he was perfect, there was no need to have such a sacrificial, suicidal approach to life. Change it. A growl came from the depths of his body and soul, a vicious momentum defiant to the very end, the sort that didn't want to accept that he no longer had a body at all. He didn't need a body to draw runes in the first place. All he needed was his will and his spark seed, a spark seed that was moments from blooming. Roar. The world around Silas seemed to freeze for a moment, and an armor began to snap and shingle itself into place. One illusory metallic layer after another, layering in gorgeous dark violets, deep blacks, touches of mahogany, and accents of gold coming together. He didn't have to sacrifice a thing if he was just better. And he was better. A pulse of crimson radiated out from what remained of Silas, his true pride seed taking root even deeper into his body, so deep that it seemed to have become an inextricable part of him, something that he had been born with rather than something that chose him after birth itself. The last piece of the Scorpion Emperor armor slid into place. It was all so perfect, so grand. Pillars of light pulsed into the air, a radiant aura spreading out across the sanctum's planet in waves of gorgeous gold. It well and truly seemed like a god was being born. 100% mastery. The realization chimed like bells in Silas's mind. He was better, he was right about himself. So long as he was strong, so long as he was all-knowing, he would be untouchable. There wouldn't be anything he couldn't do. He had done even this, something Grelith had probably spent his entire life chasing after, hoping after, only to try and steer him away from this path because he knew well that it was a dead end. Maybe that was because he thought that Silas couldn't do it and would only harm himself, or maybe it was because he felt that succeeding would only bring down even more trouble than that. Silas was fairly sure that he was right about the state of things. This warlord sanctum, maybe it was just one of many of the like. While their armors were the inferior sort, there was a higher, more perfect order out there using armors countless times more powerful. How would they react if someone below them suddenly formed this perfected armor? Maybe with rage, or maybe with acceptance, the latter of which Silas felt that he would be naive to believe. But what could he do? Purposely weaken himself for the sake of an organization he hadn't even confirmed the existence of. And in this case, he hadn't had a choice. The reason he was chasing perfection was because he had felt the control he could have over Grelith. The only way to stop the man from charging up was to form the Scorpion Emperor armor and then command him to stop. Due to the synergy between the two armors, and how perfectly Silas had drawn his, he was fairly certain that he could command Grelith to do as he pleased. That was the solution he had found. In the end, he was a step late. But he still found peace. He had done it, he had succeeded, and now this unique gene was his. He now just had to find a way to survive. Just like he always did. His will reached out. F-grade legendary gene detected. Unable to absorb. Silas froze. He froze so completely and wholly that he almost didn't notice the golden temple doors slowly opening. Chapter 1308, Foolishness. Silas had forgotten. There was a price to pay when you poured all of your focus onto one task, not letting anything else distract you. On the one hand, it had made his speed so much faster. On the other, he had forgotten his greatest flaw. It didn't matter how powerful his rune mastery was, nor did it matter how great and amazing he turned out to be. His starting position would always be the factor that held him back the most. Maybe there was a fantasy land he could live in where he mastered all of the Beast Emperor armors and claimed a legendary gene from each one of them, crafting himself into the perfect specimen. But right now, Silas' body probably couldn't even withstand a gold gene, not that he had ever had the chance to try, let alone multiple legendary ones. It was like the world was reminding him that he was still at the bottom of the barrel, that it didn't matter how highly he thought of himself, it would remind him of where his place truly was. In the gutter. That was what he deserved. You're sure? Faint sounds reached the edges of Silas' consciousness. But for it to do so, it was certain that whoever was speaking had a booming voice. No, it wasn't just a booming voice. Silas could ignore practically everything in the state that he was in. He was nothing more than a wisp of emerald floating in the wind, ready to be whisked away at any point. Even the Scorpion Emperor armor he had formed was no more. His will was practically crumbling, and there was nothing here for it to continue to cling to. As for Grelith, he was a mess on the ground, vaguely humanoid in a twisting mesh of armor, flesh, and bone. He had completely lost consciousness, and the only reason he was still alive at all was because he was a C tier. But even then, he probably didn't have very long to live either. All this time it took for him to reach the Beast Warlord's sanctum, and it was practically like whatever fantasies he was dreaming of were coming crashing down right this moment. Those thoughts of control, of taking the reins of his life, of improving one bound after the next until he could stand atop the world. The voice was only able to reach him so clearly because it was laced with a subconscious will so powerful that even Silas couldn't ignore it, even if he wanted to. It was like it was forcing the world to listen to them. And then he heard the click and clack of someone walking down those golden steps. It was such a departure from what they had experienced just now. Grelith couldn't even make it to the 10th, and yet this person was walking down from a much higher stage as though there wasn't any pressure at all. Not by choice of his own, Silas was forced to look at the people ahead of him. It was much like their voice had penetrated into his psyche, their presence couldn't be ignored by him either. Not only was he forced to listen, but he was forced to look, to pay attention, to give them his earnest senses instead of just a periphery segment of his mind. It wasn't more than two people, one middle-aged, the other young. Both wore a combined mesh of leather and beastskin armor, and while they looked human for the most part, they had those familiar, penetrating violet eyes that somehow seemed very much not. The middle-aged man had slick, graying hair, a mishmash of black and white strands that gave him a signature, almost silver fox-like appearance that women loved so much. And then the young man that followed after him seemed to have gained the same handsome air from his middle-aged counterpart, their relation as clear as day. He had an unreadable, calm expression, unbothered and unmoved by the world. It was probably the sort of look that Silas gave most everyone he met. Neither seemed to help the other down the stairs, they moved themselves. In his forced, focused state, Silas was able to hear that panicking, shocked voice from earlier finally reply to the question he had been forced to hear earlier as well. Yes, of course, I am sure. I wouldn't call your lordships here otherwise. They reached the bottom of the steps, gazing at the mess that was Grelith. There was nothing that remained of Silas at all other than that fluttering mass of emerald. It was just that while to Silas he seemed quite dim, to those around him he was shining as bright as a sun. A mortal looking directly at him would be blinded for the rest of their lives, and even the young man beside the middle-aged man's side had to squint and blink, looking away from time to time. The middle-aged man waved a hand, and against Scylla's will, he was pulled into the man's palm. It was then the indifferent look on the man's face became shock as well. He waved another hand, and the legendary gene hovering in Scylla's will, protected by him as though hoping for a miracle, was pulled out. While Scylla tried to keep it, to fight for what he had forged for himself, he couldn't. And deep inside, he knew that it was useless even to try. That gene, it could only be formed once and absorbed once. If it could be crafted again, Grelith would have never warned him to only take it in when he was sure he had reached the limit of his potential. Now, it was in the hands of another he didn't know, and his mind was far too foggy to deduce the obvious answer. Or care to in the first place. The blow he had just suffered was heavy. Maybe even heavier than that day in the volcano. This is the answer to your foolishness. It will fix everything. The middle-aged man's eyes glinted with excitement, looking over toward the young man with what seemed like a mixture of relief and exasperation. Chapter 1309. Maybe. There was a flicker of defiance in the young man's eyes before he looked away. Clearly, he didn't want to admit his mistake, but judging by the aura he was radiating, he was clearly well past the F tier. What good was it for him to have an F-grade legendary gene now? If Scylla's were in his normal state of mind, the answer would have been obvious from the context of their conversation. Judging by whatever realm these two came from, the young man was probably quite young when he was completing his F-tier foundation, maybe even a toddler. The odds that a child would make a mistake were quite high. The fact this middle-aged man thought Scylla's rune would fix things also probably meant that this young man hadn't made the same mistake again. So could that mean that Scylla's was meeting the first Spark Masters other than himself now? Less of that defiance and maybe you'd be able to keep up with the others. The middle-aged man's excitement faded as he regained his composure. This time, though, it was the young man who experienced a flash of rage. I can keep up just fine. No, you cannot. Because you didn't listen to me back then, you thought you could do things at your own pace. Now look at you. You've been permanently a half step behind them all despite being no less talented, if not more. Have you learned your lesson now? I was 3 years old. And so were they. They don't have half my intellect. All they could do was follow instructors. I was able to make modifications to my Emperor armor. And look where that got you. The young man seemed like he wanted to argue more, but the middle-aged man cut him off. Enough. Take this to the elders. They will help you to integrate it properly without destroying everything, as usual. Do not do things on your own again. Go. The middle-aged man whipped out a box and put the legendary gene inside of it, handing it to the young man and shoving him away. It only took the young man a glance to see that the box was protected in ways he couldn't unlock even if he wanted to. Clearly, only those so-called elders would be able to do it. Ever since that mistake so many years ago, the middle-aged man had been watching him like a hawk at every step. Even now, he wasn't taking any risks. There wasn't any child in the last 20-odd years that could form an F-grade Scorpion Emperor armor to spark mastery, that they could also just take the gene from like this, and there certainly wouldn't be another Scylla's coming along anytime soon. So this was their last chance to get things right, and clearly, his father wasn't about to let him fuck things up again. What are you going to do with them? The young man asked. That is none of your concern. Go. This time, the young man couldn't stay behind even if he wanted to. His body was sent up in a spiral of ether, zooming through the steps as though they were nothing more than a normal walk. Once his son was gone, the man finally turned his attention back to the floating wool that remained of Scylla's. His hand twitched for a moment, and it seemed he had every intention of crushing what remained, until he sighed and shook his head. There were 2 reasons he couldn't. The first was the same reason Scylla's couldn't deal with a certain Florineth temptress. As important as Nissa was to Scylla's breakthrough, it could be said that Scylla's was even more important to his sons. As for the second reason, it seemed he had a bit of a conscience. He sent his son away because he didn't want him to think too much about it. Though, he was probably worrying too much. Considering his son's arrogance, he didn't take a mistake he made at 3 years old very seriously at all. It was a childish mistake he thought he could still make up for to this day. At most, he would think Silas to be the equivalent of a plumber he called to his house to fix a leak for him, even though he was well capable of doing it himself. He wasn't worried about this affecting his son's will or future. Once again, he was just being overly cautious. But the middle-aged man shook his head. You might be angry, or maybe not. I can sense your will right now, it's quite distraught, broken, even. It's hard to tell if you'd ever recover. But you would do well to remember that whether I took your accomplishments away or not, that legendary gene isn't something you could absorb. In addition, without my intervention, today would be your death date. The world is an unfair place, and one genius isn't enough to reverse things. Maybe you have a right to stand by my son's side in your mind, maybe you even believe yourself to be above him, but the reality doesn't bear out like that because your parents were too weak, and your grandparents before them. Work hard, and maybe you can become the foundation of someone in the future who actually can. Don't do something foolish and get yourself killed. The middle-aged man looked from what remained of Silas and then over to Grelith. He tilted his head to the side, and a hint of surprise and irony flashed in his gaze for a moment before he shook his head once again. It wasn't ironic at all. If anything, Grelith's existence only proved his words all the more. I'll save you and your master's life. I can sense the wheel of fortune on you as well, so I will give you an opportunity. When you come to, if you manage to regain your sense of will and purpose, maybe you will make something of yourself. A glow of light came from the middle-aged man and it washed over Silas and Grelith. Chapter 13:10. Firecracker. Silas' eyes flashed open. The dome above him was a faint golden hue, lines of violet being etched across it. His hands shot up to his chest, thinking he'd grasp at air, only to find that the madness key really was still there. It didn't take him long to recall what happened and the situation that he was in now. Not to mention, he noticed that the scorned raps were also still present. Honestly, he had no idea how they had done it, but they always seemed capable of bending reality around themselves. At the very least, even that middle-aged man didn't seem to have noticed what happened. Silas pulled himself to the edge of the bed he sat on, and the world around him swayed. It wasn't because he was dizzy, but instead because it was like the runes were shifting and changing as the world bent and twisted. In one moment, he had felt like he was lying on a luxurious bed in a palace of violet gold, and in the next moment, he was sitting on a cot in a straw hut. Though he described it as such, the room was clean and smelled of fresh rainwater and grass. There wasn't a single bug in sight, almost as though it was taken from an idealized vision of what nature should be instead of what it truly was. Silas sat there for a while, loose linen boxes being his only hint of clothing. There was no rage in him anymore, nor was there any despair. But the fact there wasn't made him question things as he recalled. In those moments, it was like his true pride seed and the others had rushed to hide. And without them, it was like his sense of self had crumbled. No. It was deeper than that. The surface answer was that without his pride seed, his pride crumbled too easily. But that wasn't exactly what happened. His true pride seed and his pride were one and the same now. The latter birthed the former, and it was what allowed the existence of him as a true vessel of sin. When his seeds went away, they weren't just taking themselves away, but also taking a part of himself. That made his mind more fragile. That was all to say that he and his seeds were practically one and the same now. There was no easy way to separate them, as he had already noticed under the effects of taboo bond. Silas looked down at his hand. It looked much the same, as though nothing at all had changed, and yet everything had. Slowly, he stood to his feet and opened up the hut's door. A wall of wind hit him, nothing harsh, but most definitely enough to blow his hair back. Out in the distance, there was a large horizon stretching far in meandering curves of thick greenery. The sun peeked over the horizon, and when Silas looked to his side, he found someone unfamiliar sitting on a rock nearby. The young man had spikes coming down along his back and out of his cheeks. They seemed flexible and loose enough to blow in the wind, and yet somehow also rigid enough that you wouldn't want to touch them with a 10-foot pole. The poison ether that hung in the air was thick and heavy, and even with his resistances, Silas held his breath and closed his paws, feeling that another sniff might end his life. Whoops, sorry about that. I'm used to being the weakest here, but between you and little sis, I guess I've got to rein that in now. You can call me Khan. I'm Master's second disciple. The young man smiled. Silas looked at him for a moment, noticing the greens that should have been the whites of his eyes and those golden irises that hovered within. There was something densely dangerous about this man, but maybe that was the case for most D-tiers to him. Unfortunately, as close as Khan was to the C-tier, he was still ultimately a D-tier. Silas could resist his presence quite well. Nice to meet you. I'm Silas Grimblade. As for which disciple number I am, I think it's 4th, but I've never confirmed. Khan blinked as though surprised that Silas could speak at all. How interesting. You're like a perfect copy of Master, aren't you? Not unlike that bastard Heir, who only knows how to pretend but is a real ball of fluff. Silas didn't respond, just looking back out to the sea of trees again. It was odd, he hadn't thought about exactly what to do yet, but maybe he should. He was wasting time. I heard that you caused quite some commotion this time. It's been a while since I've seen Master so angry, he almost charged up those steps again. I had to call in Gramps, otherwise he would have gotten himself killed. Gramps? Silas asked, not looking Khan's way. Yeah, that's what we call Master's master. Though, we hadn't actually seen him in a while before today. It seems the mess this time is quite big. The core sanctum was up in arms too. Is that so? Silas continued to look out onto the rising sun. He didn't think it was actually that big of a deal at all. Wasn't this just life? The strong took what they wanted, when they wanted. The fact he was alive was probably gift enough to them. Khan laughed. You really are like Master. It'll take more than that to get you angry, huh? Either that, or you're already so furious that you still haven't decided how you want to deal with this situation. Is that it? The laughter echoed across the tall mountain, feeding into the winds and carrying it further. But now I'm really interested. You know, little sis has a pretty hot temper too, that's why she's not even here right now. Having a second firecracker will be fun. I've been bored out of my mind here. Tell me, what are you going to do? Silas didn't answer immediately, his gaze still on the rising sun. And then a new armor began to form on his body, shingle by shingle. The Scorpion Warlord armor at 100% mastery. Kill. Silas said simply, a new unique gene hovering into existence before him. F-grade gold gene detected. Chapter 1311. Silent Oath. Silas reached out toward the gold gene and let it hover in his palm. His Scorpion Warlord armor bristled with strength and vitality, rippling out with waves of might that made Khan's pupils constrict into pinholes. Grelith's second disciple's sight might not be as good as his master's, but he was an elite Scorpion warrior himself. He knew a spark mastery armor when he saw one from his own kind, though he didn't have a good feel for just what percentage it was at. Whatever commotion Silas had caused had to have been a big deal, and this seemed to be what it had to be for the Emperor Sanctum to be alerted like they were. Even so, seeing it personally. Well fuck me, and I thought Gwenu was already enough to make my hairs grey. He blinked for a moment and then erupted into laughter. She's going to be so pissed. That little girl has such an overinflated ego. This is just perfect. Silas continued to look at the gold gene for a long while, wondering. Should he take it? What is my foundation grade right now? Silas asked. The little girl seemed to have been waiting for this exact question. Superior Common. Silas' eyes narrowed. It had to be remembered that this was the mark he would receive after absorbing everything before. Maybe. The little girl had said he'd have a surer bet at a mid-tier common foundation while building his way to the E-tier. But now she was saying that right this moment, he had a superior common foundation before he had begun to absorb his genes, his titles, and other things. And if I complete it, you should be able to just barely reach superior bronze now, factoring in your perfected D-grade rate. So this was the gift the middle-aged man had given him. A superior common foundation in exchange for a legendary gene he couldn't find anywhere else in the universe. What a great deal. You probably shouldn't blame him too much. He couldn't give you a greater foundation without literally killing you. He wasn't being cheap. Silas didn't dignify that with a response. He wasn't sure why the little girl seemed to like to press his buttons, but right now he wasn't in the mood. How many gold genes can my body take right now? In the F grade. Are you saying I could take in an E grade gene? Not now, obviously, but once you break through, it might be a possibility, though a limited one. Like I've told you before, there's a big difference between having a body that can take gold genes in the F tier, and one that can do it in above tiers. Even having a bronze gene at D tier is countless times more valuable than an F-grade legendary gene. That's why they think they're doing you a favor. To them, what they took was really just a convenient fix for a very inconvenient problem. Once again, Silas didn't take the bait. Of this caliber, you can probably take about 3 or so. But I would be careful. You've gotten reckless. What is your gene state at right now? Can you even guarantee taking that gene in? I can, Silas said indifferently. The little girl frowned, seemingly not understanding for a moment. In fact, she thought it was the pride seed speaking for a brief instant of time. Silas looked at the gold gene as though it wasn't something many would scratch and claw over. After having had a legendary gene in his grasp, he felt that this was beneath him. But since it was all his body could take, it was just going to have to be what he did. And what would my foundation be if you included my rune mastery? Silas asked. You can't. You said I probably couldn't. Not that I couldn't. Yes, you probably couldn't unless you. The eyes of the little girl widened. You. Seed inside Silas, his spark seed was stirring until a radiant golden light came out of him in waves. He wasn't able to take this final step before because he was instantly assaulted by the Scorpion Emperor, halting the progress. Then, in a half-completed state, he had managed to push the Scorpion Emperor armor to 100% mastery. What he could do with a true spark seed was on another level entirely. Answer the question, Silas said calmly as his spark seed bloomed into a true spark, forming tendrils of golden roots that spread throughout his consciousness and will core, reaching deep into his layers and even further beneath with every passing moment. You would certainly reach. The little girl frowned. The calculation was much more difficult with something as variable as a true spark. Not all true sparks were created equal. At the same time, there was a bit of a curve as well. The system really liked it when the weak did the impossible. It showed it new paths toward success, and thus there would be rewards that came with that. However, this time, the system hadn't rewarded Silas for some reason. It was likely because the proof of his accomplishment had been taken away before it could register it, while his real body had been seen as dead or in a state of limbo for a short while before the middle-aged man saved his life. My best guess is superior silver. Silas said calmly, and if I raised my 2 gene classes to legendary. Inferior gold. That, for now, was going to have to be good enough. He knew what to do. With a squeeze of his hand, Silas shattered the gold gene and his armor crumbled with it. Rapidly, a new, modified armor began to form, one laced with far more emerald than there was violet or black, one that sparked with lightning that seemed to cause a weather change even in the skies above. He'd make a new path. He didn't care to make them feel regret. He would make them feel fear. He would make them feel despair. All of the emotionless weight on Silas' shoulders seemed to vanish, and the skies boomed, the planet rumbling. He didn't speak out of a vow this time, but the words he would have spoken were etched into reality nonetheless as a sacred system oath was made. Thunder boomed, and lightning, reflected as green gems, pulsed like raging dragons across it. The last shingle of the armor fell into place. Class upgraded, Glassvault Duke, Gold, greater than Glassborn Christ Emperor, Legendary. Chapter 13:12, One Way. Sparks of lightning danced in Silas' eyes, a sharpness radiating from him until his skin almost looked like it was outfitted with a thin layer of glass. His hair had practically become sharp strands of crystal that slowly faded to its original black. And yet, from time to time, as the sun continued to rise over the horizon and its rays beamed through their filaments, it looked as though the effect had remained. Silas exhaled a breath, the fogginess of it sparking like thundering rain clouds from the corners of his mouth. However, he seemed completely unimpressed. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human Simioid D. Affiliation, Legacy 7777, Progenitor of Earth, Golden Grove Elder, Beast Warlord Sanctum 073. Class, Glassborn Christ Emperor, Legendary, F. Class, Primal Lord, Silver, F. Profession, Vipermancer, Bronze, E. Profession, Runeweaver, EEE+. Level, 50. Coins, 837,111,132,382, F, 8212,261, E, 1232, D. It was about as he expected. Every time he had an enormous breakthrough in his glass-volt ether path, his gene class followed along. This was even more exaggerated than the Glassborn Christ Emperor raw template he got from his rewards. Essentially, his ability to progress his gene class forward was far superior to practically anyone else due to these two seeds within him. However, despite having the chaotic Simioid raw template, his primal lord gene class was still silver and lagging far behind. But he knew how to fix that. He looked toward Khan. How do I get to Ape Warlord territory? Khan was still in the middle of blinking. Aren't you going to absorb that? His gaze shifted toward the gold gene in Scylla's palm. I haven't decided yet. There was a flicker in Khan's eyes when he heard this, and then he sighed. Well, now that's quite the interesting choice of words, now isn't it? And now you want to go to the Ape Warlords. I can't imagine that's because you want to join them. Khan's head tilted to the side, and there was a hint of danger in his tone, his aura leaking out. However, much like Scylla's had said already, A D tier was still A D tier, no matter how close they were to the C tier. Scylla stared back, his gaze indifferent, his eyes carrying more depth now than they seemingly had ever before. It didn't feel like you were looking at flesh and blood at all, but instead a beautifully sculpted glass orb, perfectly replicated twice over. There were so many bouncing lights, various shades of green, and mirror-like depths in his irises that it didn't feel like you were looking at a human anymore at all. I guess I was wrong, Khan eventually said. You're a lot crazier than a firecracker. Gwennu still has some sense of belonging and measure when she does things. You, however, really know how to push things to the extreme limit. I guess you really could get away with some wild things in short order because of the current situation. After another long while, he shook his head. It's not complicated. I'm sure you can figure it out. The teleportation hub is at the bottom of the mountain. I'm not helping you get there, though. If you're too slow, that's your problem. Scylla's flickered and vanished before the words finished. Khan was clearly wasting his time. If it was that easy to figure out, then he would. A flash of lightning appeared a distance away, and the howl of the hollow wing pierced through the skies. Khan was surprised again, wondering what in the hell that creature was before it flashed and vanished, crossing over 30 kilometers as though it was nothing at all. A journey that should have taken Scylla's days, given his strength, was cut to a few microseconds. What the hell? The problem wasn't the height of the mountain. It was the danger on it. Khan had felt that Scylla's would probably get trapped somewhere and be forced to have someone save him. But he just made it down the mountain in an instant instead. Khan stood up and seemed about to do something before he paused. He shook his head again and then sat back down. Whatever, they brought it onto themselves, I guess. I wonder if this'll make Master's negotiating power better or worse, though. Scylla's appeared in a familiar hub after the teleportation completed. With a sweep of his gaze, he found that Khan was at least not lying about one thing. It was fairly straightforward to get to the Ape Sanctum. Everything was clearly marked and delineated. However, actually going was another matter. You couldn't just go to another moon as a person not of that sanctum just because you wanted to. He didn't have the necessary prerequisites. On top of that, just because he got there didn't mean that he would be able to access anything that he wanted either. There were rules and procedures to everything, and he didn't have the strength to just do as he pleased. He also might be a genius rune master, but this was an organization built by C-tier rune masters far superior to himself. The same tricks and advantages he could take advantage of in a small corner of the universe like the Milky Way weren't things that he could even begin to replicate here. So what was he going to do? Maybe Khan was right to be so lackadaisical. It wasn't as though an F-tier could flip the sanctum on its head even if he wanted to, least of all the Ape Sanctum, one of the four absolute strongest. Scylla's didn't have a plan immediately yet either. What he did know from what Khan had mentioned, though, was that he didn't have much time to work with and very little room to make something happen. And then his eyes landed on it. Maybe that's the only way. The idea of getting his hands on the fundamental strokes of the Ape Warlord armor was probably impossible. In that case, he would have to study it himself. In that case, there was only one way to do that. His gaze landed on the F-tier ranking list, with his name at the very top. Chapter 1313, Feral. Bang! Silas landed in the middle of an arena, his aura rippling out in waves of wild sparks of lightning. One piece of the Scorpion Warlord armor after another snapped into place, sounding so solid and real it reverberated akin to metal sliding along metal and mountains clashing against mountain. As soon as the last piece slid into place, the world roared and his tail swayed. Ahead, on the bottom of the stage, Alex cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. He had put on formal wear, a black suit, finely pressed, adorning him from head to toe along with a nice top hat. He played his part all too well. In the crowd, not too far off, old Brahma stood next to Jala, shaking his head. Both were wondering what was going on and wanted to ask more questions, but Alex seemed gung-ho with what he had already gotten. They weren't even technically allowed to be here, but apparently, rules didn't matter anymore. Ahem. Attention, attention. Alex's voice boomed, his voice being projected not by himself, but by a clever set of runes that Silas had so graciously given him. In fact, Alex hoped that he could keep it. This was nice. If Silas' commotion hadn't already sent off waves, then this certainly did. Silas was no longer the nameless youth that came by just a few days ago. He was number 1 on the F-tier list, a man who had quickly become known for his prowess. But he was also a person that many were dissatisfied with. He had jumped to number 1 on the F-tier list without even beating Scarvel at his very best. They had all seen the battle. Silas was powerful, but Scarvel had never even used his warlord armor. How could someone be ranked number 1 based on that performance alone? It was ridiculous. But now, to be quite frank and honest with you all, my young master here doesn't take even a single one of you seriously. You see, he's been hearing a lot of talk recently, and he's not exactly the patient sort of guy, but he also doesn't have the time to deal with every Tom, Dick, or Harry that wants to challenge him either. So listen up, folks. We're giving you a flash deal, a sale for the ages. It's quite simple to participate, you just have to be of either the lion, serpent, ape, or whale lineages. Like I said, my boy here doesn't like wasting time, and he's not of the opinion that anyone else is worthy of his own. Let's start systematically. Alex unveiled a scroll and it unraveled until it slapped heartily against the ground. But even then, the list of names on it was actually quite short. In fact, there were only 4 names total. Seems I pulled the ape lineage list out first. It seems you guys will be the lucky first few. Alrighty, then. 23rd ranked F-tier disciple Brenner Carr. You have exactly 30 minutes to respond to this challenge, or, in the names of me, myself, and I, you are what we like to call a pussy-ass bitch, on Earth. Alex snapped his scroll closed, clasped his hands behind his back and smiled. Feel free to also inform number 17 Raoul Gorick, number 9 Ria Sarvekius, and number 3 Tauren Kale that they are next, in that order. Honestly, my young master is only a little bit interested in this Tauren character and is graciously giving him as much time as he needs to appear. The rest of you can kick rocks for all we care. The commotion these words caused was immediate and almost haunting. In the midst of the chaos, old Brahma shook his head, wondering if he'd ever survive long enough to get any real help out of Silas. At this point, one of the 2 of them would get themselves killed before that day came. Silas continued to stand at the center of the arena, his eyes closed. It was as though he hadn't heard anything at all. His blood was relaxed, his heartbeat steady, his muscles almost dormant. But one scene after another played out in his mind. As his tail swished from side to side, a violence was bubbling up in his bones, causing the runes around him to practically spontaneously combust. Bang! The stage shook, a bear warlord disciple had landed, directly bypassing Alex. Honestly, Alex didn't even try to stop him. He knew he didn't have the strength to, and knowing Silas, he probably already expected this would happen. I am ranked 78th, my name. Bang! Whatever they would have thought to say was cut off. Silas didn't even open his eyes, his telekinesis slamming into the disciple's chest with the force of a mountain. The bear lineage disciple was sent flying into the distance, his body practically shattering against the leaderboard that hung high above. He slipped down slowly, coughing out mouthfuls of blood that held shredded flesh and thickened clots. Sparks of emerald lightning continued to flash around Silas, his eyes still closed. Well, Alex cleared his throat again. As you all can see, he doesn't have the best temper. So if you're not on the list, it's probably because you aren't strong enough. I don't really know how dumb you have to be to put your head on a platter like that without being called out first. Those of the bear lineage rushed to help the young man up as the crowd's commotion reached a new peak. Slowly, a woman with short-cut hair formed into wild spikes moved forward. She hardly wore much at all, her lower half covered by a pair of spandex-like short shorts that barely covered a quarter of her thighs, and her chest wrapped in a bearskin band. A rippling set of glistening abs flashed between the both of them, while a pair of long canines flashed through her grin. Despite her wild choice in hair and dress, she was the sort of beauty a mortal might see once in a lifetime. Slowly, her ape warlord armor snapped into place as well as she stepped onto the stage. I hear I was called here by you, handsome. Her grin became wild to the point she almost seemed feral, her canines lengthening even more. Chapter 13-14. Stand Up. Silas had tuned out the world, and ironically enough, even Brenna herself. He was looking at the ape warlord armor. Although it sounded like it was formed of metal shingle like the others, it was distinctly less armor-like than the others Silas had seen. Though, the bear warlord armor was a bit similar in this respect. The arms extended longer than that of the person wearing the armor. There was bristling illusory fur that coated them, and though the canines that extended from Brenna's teeth were all her own, this helm had some of its own, even opening as though a visor to reveal the face of the one within and closing at will. The ape warlord armor was surprisingly crimson and emitted a shocking amount of bloodlust. All of Brenna's inner thoughts seemed to be amplified several times over, and Silas could even feel something pressing on his mind as though trying to influence him. Like madness. But far weaker. Though, it was a bit hard to tell in the moment if it was weaker because Brenna's will was so weak compared to his own, or if it was because the method overall was inferior to his madness comprehension. Silas had a feeling that it was both. Then there was the biggest problem he was facing here. If he was trying to study off of someone's paper, that should make things easier. But that was only under the assumption that they would most definitely get 100% of the answers correct. The problem with using these F-tiers to comprehend the ape warlord armor was that they were also incompetent. This Brenna was ranked 23rd, but her armor was drawn to the exact same specs as Castiel's had been. She was probably only ranked so high because the ape warlord armor was stronger, and potentially harder to learn as well, but her actual rune mastery was no less pitiful. How was he supposed to learn anything from these poorly constructed runes? There was a flash in Silas' eyes and Brenna's ape warlord armor crumbled as she was about to make another flirty joke. Her eyes widened and she tapped a foot, rapidly accelerating back to the edge of the arena, her heart beating out of her chest. A completely drawn armor should have had more protections against Silas than that. Unfortunately for them, after his rune mastery reached perfection, or at least the start of perfection, whatever that meant, his runeweaver eyes had touched a completely different level as well. His rune comprehension and his runeweaver profession had always gone hand in hand. Before, what should have been impossible due to their unique gene acting as an anchor had become possible once more. He could dismiss almost any F-grade warlord armor with a push of his intention. Is that all? Silas asked. Brenna's lust faded to fury, her canines extended once again. It felt like with a few more inches, they would become something far more like tusks than they were ever like canines. There was a reddening in her eyes and her hair stood on end, even down to her arms. Bang! Her aura exploded and her clothes seemed to go with them, but before anyone could see what was underneath their scantness, her crimson armor began to shingle into place once more. It was as expected. She had held back for the sake of speed before. But since Silas was being so arrogant and giving her so much time, she would take advantage of it and show him the true extent of her ape warlord armor. Roars filled the skies and howling pulses of ether swept forth in waves. Many weaker members in the crowd found their eyes turning red as they nearly lost themselves to the madness, but they were quickly saved by barriers and intervention from their seniors. The last shingle slotted into place and their arms slammed into the ground as though she had well and truly become an ape. For some reason, Silas felt a wave of disgust overtake him. It reminded him of the visions he had seen of Gogo's ancestor, once swimming through the skies and climbing the clouds, suddenly forced to crawl on his belly along the ground. The scene was so different, and somehow supposed to be a point of strength for Brenna. It was a sign that her armor was more complete, that she had done what so many others couldn't hope to do and formed it to soul mastery. And yet in Scylla's eyes, it looked just the same. Stand up. The words came out in a stream of will that hardly seemed his own, and yet came from the depths of his heart. It felt as though he were looking at an ancestor of his degrading and debasing themselves. Without even his runeweaver eyes, Brenna was sent flying, her armor shattering to pieces. She fell hundreds of meters away, separating the crowd like the sea as she fell in a naked heap of her own flesh and blood. Class upgraded. Primal Lord, Silver, greater than Primal Sovereign, Gold. The disgust slowly faded from Scylla's eyes as his Scorpion Warlord armor shook. It seemed as though it might collapse beneath the strong great ape aura he was suddenly resonating, but he had made one thing very clear when he began his path. His will was what would dictate things, not that of others, not that of an unknown ancestor, and certainly not that of a power he had casually chosen to pick up. Had he descended from the great apes? Yes, he had. But today, he was the primal sovereign, not them. Their current descendants seemed to deem it fit to press their fists to the ground and crawl around as though to make it easier to kneel before the next powerhouse they faced. Unacceptable. He could already sense the path toward the Ape Emperor armor, but he had yet to even comprehend the Ape Warlord armor. If he wanted to do the former, he would need to comprehend the latter first. Luckily, his next target seemed to already be here. Two figures flashed into the crater Brenna lay in, their eyes hot with fury. Chapter 13-15, Fluctuating Leaderboard. It wasn't difficult for Scylla to tell who they were. They were more than likely Raoul Goric, number 17, and Ryasar Vekius, number 9. This wasn't just because he felt Tauren Kale, number 3, would take the longest to appear, but because he had gotten more of a feel for how strong they should be by observing from afar. The thing was, though, it didn't really matter which of them it was. Raoul and Ryasar looked like a pair of brothers. They came from a race with particularly large hands and forearms, something that should have looked out of place on their bodies but somehow just fit. The skin was leathery to stony depending on the section and how the sun hit them, while their eyes seemed to sink into their skulls, their foreheads bone practically forming an overhang that shaded them from the sun. Holy shit, a pair of Neanderthals in the flesh. This is embarrassing. I wasn't planning on meeting the grandparents anytime soon, Alex said, a bit flushed. Listen, I know she's naked, but we really didn't do anything, I promise. I would never disrespect my future wife like this, but this guy Scylla's, between you and me, he's always had a temper and has no idea how to treat the fairer sex. Raoul and Ryasar both looked toward Alex, an aura that nearly shattered the latter's knees falling over him. Luckily, it was old Brahma that appeared to save him from a terrible fate. How about less talking if you don't have the strength to back it up? Brahma hissed in his ears. Truthfully, as powerful as the old man was, he wasn't comfortable with being here at all. There were certainly countless in the sanctum more powerful than him, although he was confident in putting his rune mastery up against anyone. The trouble was that with the path he had chosen to take, after pouring so much money into Andromeda, the money he had left over to outfit himself with what would allow his greatest strengths to be displayed was highly limited. It could be said that old Brahma was at maybe 5 to 10% of his actual strength output potential right now, and there was little they could do to fix that unless they dismantled Andromeda and used it for parts. Whether it was old Brahma or Scylla's, though, neither wanted to see that. What do you mean? Alex said with a bright smile. I have you and Scylla's. Old Brahma almost wanted to knock Alex's head off his shoulders. Who are you? Raoul growled, standing to his feet. Seemingly carrying the arrogance of a sanctum disciple, he faced off against the C-tier as though he might leap into battle with him instead. Outsiders aren't allowed in the sanctum. Actually, Alex coughed, this isn't technically the sanctum, it's just the gathering hub. Read your rulebook for once. And second, I've already told you that Psycho-SYL over there isn't very patient. Or is it that you're scared to fight him and want to find an excuse to delay? Scared, Raoul's voice boomed, but before he could say more, Ryasar placed a hand on his shoulder. I will go. Before Raoul could say anything, Ryasar Vekius, number 9 ranked on the F-tier leaderboards, landed on the platform. As enraged as the both of them were, it didn't take a genius to figure out that anyone who could defeat Brenna with a phrase wasn't someone Raoul could face. Moreover, there were large leaps in power the closer to the peak of the leaderboard you got. The F-tier leaderboard underwent huge changes every year because no one spent much time in the F-tier to begin with. As such, it was widely variable. Sometimes, those in the F-tier were just children. At other times, they were late bloomers that came from famed corners of the galaxy, only to be brought over by various elders and powerhouses. After all, lineage heads weren't the only ones that could take in disciples. It was just that the disciples faced the hardest time for obvious reasons. That was to say that at any given moment, number 100 on the F-tier leaderboard could swap out for two people of vastly different strengths as dozens ascended or dozens more were brought in from the outside. That was to say that beneath a certain rank, an F-tier of the sanctum could be as weak as lambs or as powerful as thundering mountains. However, above a certain rank, it was a different story entirely. The top 10 of the F-tier leaderboard, of any of the leaderboards, for that matter, was a sacred place. These people tended to be in a tier of their own. The top 3 was an even wider gap. And due to Scarvel, number 1 of the F-tier had once been an even more shocking gap. That was to say that to these people, Tauren Kale was actually the true number 1 of this generation, and Ryasar would rather be beaten to hell than to let their pride and joy be lured out so easily if he didn't have to be. He growled, and his skin seemed to become more stony as he landed on the platform. His warlord armor bloomed in rays of crimson, his eyes shining much the same color. He drew faster than even Brenner, but the tier of perfection was far higher. While they were both at soul mastery, it was clear that Ryasar was several percentage points higher. On top of that, both his first and second layers seemed to faintly touch the barrier to essence mastery, only to be suppressed back down a tier by his third layer being stuck at soul. Silas watched all of this in silence, not saying a single word or even attempting to stop it. He took in every aspect, even until the final moment when Ryasar placed his fists on the ground, his maw opening and a howl filling the air. At that moment, a bombardment of wool slammed into Silas in waves, cracking against his skin. Chapter 13:16, Last Hope. Silas stood there as though the howl was nothing more than a spring breeze. His hair kicked back, his face indifferent, and his emerald scorpion warlord armor hardly flickered even the slightest bit. It was clear that none here really understood just what Silas had drawn. Not a single person seemed to have reacted to the perfection of his armor or even what it meant for him to have it on in the first place. It was like this new Scorpion Warlord armor existed outside of their ability to comprehend. There were certainly Scorpion lineage disciples in the crowd, mixed amongst the thousands, but they didn't quite understand what they were seeing either. It hardly felt like Silas was a Scorpion they recognized in the first place. And before they could even begin to study it, it was like Silas had already ended the battle. This time, though, it felt like they might get a chance to watch a real show. Bang! Ryasar didn't seem put off by the fact Silas was unaffected. He was already prepared for it, his body flickering forward in a wild leap that extended his heavy arms well above his head. His chest roared with his fury and his fists became even heavier, their sides smashing down like hammers from above. Boom! The fists landed on a sphere of defenses, an entire meter from Silas' body. He just continued to stand there as though nothing at all had happened, his expression practically dull and lifeless with what looked like boredom, but was actually unprecedented focus. Incompetent. Everyone and everything around him just felt so completely incompetent. If only there was a spark master to study, he would have already grasped this armor's truths. It shouldn't take him so much effort to decipher it all. Boom! Ryasar grew more enraged. As though entering a berserk state, his power increased further, emotions pulling forth as wild howls continued to emit from his maw. He smashed his fists down again and again, his body flickering and vanishing in a wild sway that was hard to fathom and follow. Silas had already seen through the three capabilities of the armor. The first layer should be this wild, unpredictable movement technique. A technique that reminded him almost too much of Primal Step, which had just evolved once again. However, it was more complex than just a method of movement. It seemed to also be a method of attack as well. Not only did it make their steps hard to follow, but their wild attack patterns seemed to have no rhyme or reason to them, making them hard to track as well. The second layer carried their will attack within it. Their howls became laced with their maddened will, and they could use it to suppress the courage of their opponents. This layer was also a bit more complicated than it seemed as well because there was a synergy, or a potential synergy, that Silas could see between it and the first layer. If one was calculated enough, it was possible to use their voice and those howls in an array of sorts that matched the wild cadence of their own version of primal step. Essentially, by timing their howls with specific movement patterns in their movement technique, they could layer the sound waves in such a way that the disorientation was countless times stronger. It was just that Ryasar's control over this was so pitiful that Silas barely had to tilt his head from side to side a scant few degrees to eliminate it entirely. If it wasn't for the fact Silas was standing completely still, it was clear that Ryasar wouldn't have nearly the capabilities needed to use this at all. This was obviously an exceptionally high-level technique, and it probably required crossing into the essence mastery boundary before it could be used effectively. But Ryasar was still an inch from that. Whether he could perfect his third layer enough to allow that would take patience he might not have, considering how the ape warlord armor was already affecting his temperament. And then there was the third layer, the berserk layer. But it too was more complicated than that. Thanks to the second layer, it seemed capable of feeding off of the emotions of not just the user, but of the targets and surrounding victims as well. Essentially, not only did it allow the user to grow stronger based on their own fury, but also the fear and angst of the opponents they crushed or were in the process of crushing too. Now that was interesting. It was no wonder the ape warlord armor was amongst the three strongest. It wasn't just a matter of how powerful the individual layers of the armor were, but how they worked together, fed off of one another. You could confuse your opponent, attack their psyche, and then use that psyche attack to both weaken and further and strengthen yourself. It all went hand in hand in hand. The wild attacks of Ryasar faded back into being for Silas and his gaze finally regained a hint of focus. He was done with studying this man. He wasn't good enough. Most of what he had learned were extrapolations he wasn't quite yet sure were perfect just yet. He needed more samples. Piss off. Bang. Ryasar's eyes opened wide as another simple pair of words caused his armor to explode. He was sent rocketing back, and if not for Raoul, who caught him, he would have landed in the same crater alongside Brenner. A silence fell over the arena. Was even the likes of Scarvel this dominating? But if Silas was so powerful, then why did he struggle so much against a Scarvel who hadn't even summoned his warlord armor? Confusion settled into their hearts, but the rage of it all was truly beginning to get to the ape lineage disciples in the crowd. As one of the four strongest lineages, they had never before been humiliated like this, and certainly not by a lesser lineage. Tauren, the true number one of their generation. He was the only one that could turn this around. But where was he? Chapter 13:17. Morvika Rov. And another one bites the dust. I'd say Raoul got lucky, don't you think? Well, there's about 27 minutes left before your special little number one disciple is forever labeled as a coward. Hopefully, there's at least someone in the ape lineage that can make Psycho SYL move. At least 1 inch, right? Aren't you all supposed to be official disciples or something? Alex shook his head before a light of sympathy came to his eyes. Well, I guess this must just be the gap between disciples and true disciples. He nodded as though it made sense. There was currently no one in the F tier that was a true disciple, as in a disciple of one of the lineage heads. Neither Scarvel nor Tauren were, despite their power. Silas, on the other hand, was. This seemed like an out for them, a reason to explain why they were being dominated, an excuse to get them out of it. However, Alex was more clever than that for 2 reasons. First, the fact that something so obvious had to be pointed out to them wasn't a point of relief, it was a point of embarrassment. True disciples had always been on a level all to themselves. The idea they felt it was ridiculous for one to rank number one was just a product of the anomaly that was Scarvel. Even Gwenu hadn't been able to take the number one spot when it was her turn, but that was also because she was impatient and wanted to hurry along to E tier. Because she knew that she wouldn't be able to make it to Spark Mastery, she settled for 1 stage below and progressed. The extra few percentage points weren't worth the years wasted since no big leap was coming. Plus, the gap between Scarvel and the others wasn't just due to his armor. It was his base physical stats that could be quickly overtaken by entering the E tier with Gwenu's talent. And second, with how arrogant these geniuses were, telling them that they were just inferior would never make them feel better. If anything, it would light a fire in him to prove you wrong. Very wrong. Would the man known as the true number one of this generation, when the anomaly of Scarvel was eliminated, well and truly be satisfied with such a result? Pa, pa, pa. The sound of clapping reverberated through the arena and a figure slowly appeared. He could only be described as handsome beyond words, the sort of perfect entity that appeared in paintings and fantasy stories, but could never seem to exist in real life. He had the pointed ears of an elf, though they were longer and more exaggerated than how they would be described even in the fairy tales. Each of those ears was adorned with 3 simple golden earrings, small and low profile, but glitteringly bright nonetheless. His skin was a faint violet color that almost seemed to glow as he moved, and he had the look of a knight that had come dressed in partial armor to remind those at a dinner party ball what he did for a living without looking too informal. However, his aura was not that of an ape at all. He had the aura of a serpent. And he wasn't in the F tier at all. In fact, he was already level 100 and was currently building his foundation to D tier much like Gwenu. This man was Morvic Aroth, the youngest disciple of the 713th Serpent Warlord and the current number 1 on the E tier leaderboards. As for number 2, that was Gwenu, Scylla's unruly senior sister that he had yet to meet. You know, when the Scorpion lineage got my beautiful Gwenu, I thought that would be the last bit of interest they would be able to give me. I didn't expect that you would appear not long later and seemingly have even more potential than she did. Tell me, is that a Spark Mastery armor? There was a light of almost greed in Morvok's eyes, his beautiful lavender irises squeezing together to turn his rounded pupils into slits for just a moment before they popped back to normal. One could practically see a slithering tongue come out of his lips, but that seemed to be more illusion than not. However, he embodied the aura of a serpent so much and so perfectly that his every movement seemed to elicit the memory of one. Silas could see it even more clearly than any one of them, the way that serpent coiled and wrapped around Morvok's body. It filled him with disgust. Something in him practically snapped. This wasn't a true serpent either. Get up here. Morvok froze, and then he blinked. What did you say to me? Silas reached out a palm, and sparks of electricity seemed to jump from him. Every place a bolt landed, the ground and stone seemed to be corrupted, turning to crystal shards and then shattering. I said, get up here, you worthless waste of space. Morvok's eyes widened before he began to laugh. He laughed so uproariously the skies seemed to turn violet as well. And then he flickered and vanished. In an instant, he was on the platform, having moved so fast that even some D-tiers seemed to have lost track of him. Alex couldn't help but become a hint more serious, his gaze flickering. Old Brammer was more than just serious, he was worried. Something had definitely happened to Silas, and it affected his mood all too obviously. The question was whether he still had real control of himself right now, or if he was letting everything be dictated by those emotions. All Silas could feel, though, was his disgust. The Serpentess were meant to fly through the skies and command the clouds. To distill one down to a temptress, licking their lips with greed, and poisoning one with their words. That was the antithesis of what being a Serpentess meant to him. I'm not sure what's gotten into you, Morvok said with a calm smile that hid daggers. But it seems I'll have to put you in your place in your master's stead. The Scorpions have always been beneath our heel and will remain that way. I'll show you what true poison is meant to look like. He didn't say another word. He didn't even summon his armor, as a fog of violet spread out from him slowly. Chapter 1318. Trash. Silas' aura bristled, whipping through the air like whipping lines of emerald. However, as powerful as it was, it seemed so dim, so weak, so inferior. And how could it not? It was facing off against an existence that stood just a step away from the D tier. As powerful as Silas had become, he was too far from such a thing. The gap between himself and a person raised in this environment, classified as a genius themselves, and a whole 50 levels above him was too much. And yet, he seemed completely unmoved. His aura, which should have been directly suppressed by the rippling waves of violet, was not. In fact, greater than suppress less than E rank greater than Serpentess beasts by less than 72% greater than and ignore rank suppression. Morvok stood there so confidently, waiting for his poison to weed into Silas' ether and force him to his knees. He was already imagining the scene of Silas being forced to beg for his life. In truth, Morvick didn't have any real animosity for Scylla's. He was more curious than anything else, especially since he had heard through the grapevine that Scylla's actually had a bit of the scent of a serpent on him. However, it could be said that the captain of a certain ship was very desperate. He seemed willing to say a lot of things. He had also said that Scylla smelt of an ape as well, but standing right here, Morvick didn't sense any of that. Of course, his senses were far inferior to Ace's. But no one else seemed to have confirmed this. This was because Scylla's had learned quite a lot in the 3 months that it took for him to get here, including how to properly hide those mix of auras of stop others from looking at him sideways. It wasn't exactly a crime to have such auras on him, but it would make others very interested in his secrets. His vipermancy profession was especially potent, and if the serpent lineage learned that there existed a disciple that could crush them with a thought, it'd be a wonder how they'd react. But the situation had changed. And quite frankly, he no longer cared. Black scales began to form across Scylla's body. Gogo's power swarmed into him in waves, his eyes turning a golden hue as his pupils became slit. His power skyrocketed, his armor seemingly becoming even stronger to accompany it. Somehow, the clash between the serpent and scorpion didn't bother him nearly as much as it should. Whereas before they couldn't even begin to coexist, the situation now was entirely different. Boom. Greater than intuition. Scylla's eyes flickered, and the poison dispersed, their runes crumbling in real time. Morvok's eyes hardly had time to widen before the fist compressed his gut. His inner organs twisted with a turn of Scylla's wrist, a blow that collapsed his airways and practically turned his mouth into a vacuum pump expelling all the oxygen in his body shattered even wind. As though broken glass, collapsing currents erupted to Morvok's back. It looked almost as though Scylla's punch was so powerful that the space behind the serpent true disciple couldn't withstand it. A wheeze came from Morvok's lips, his body keeling over. He collapsed to a knee. Rips tore across Scylla's skin, the 5000% boost under the effects of his beast totem practically turning his body into its own science experiment. But even as his flesh tore, his blood running down in rivers, he stood tall. Unlike the ant before him, Alex's pupils were constricted into pinholes. Even he didn't understand what he was seeing right now. What kind of power was this? Trash. The echo of Scylla's voice seemed to be the only sound in the entire arena. The whistle-like breaths of Morvick being a secondary contender. Even now, he couldn't seem to take a deep breath at all. It was mostly the punch, but there was something particularly suffocating about Scylla's aura as well. His ether wasn't moving correctly, he found it impossible to draw runes, and somewhere deep instead, he didn't even want to look up. He feared what he would see in the eyes looking down on him right now. The moment he had the thought, something within Morvick seemed to snap. His will shuddered out in a rippling wave. How dare you? He still didn't have enough breath in him, so his voice was soft, and the ache that came from his entire torso felt like knives scrapping along the inner lining of his abdominal muscles. But they sounded clear enough to him. The likes of you could never. The rippling of his will grew stronger, and then Scylla sensed it leap over a barrier, crossing from forging to forged. It practically took solid form, a violet aura that peeled across the skies. For a brief instant, he seemed to regain control of himself, and with that small space of breathing room, he proved himself to be worthy of the number 1 ranked spot of the E-tier disciples. His serpent warlord armor snapped into place, drawn to a vitality mastery. The speed, the precision, it was all so perfect. And in that same instant, Scylla's intuition ability of one kind for me spoke all of the secrets of the armor to him in perfect synchronity. If only his goal here had been to understand this. Bang! Scylla's blocked the swing of a violet tail with an elbow, his reactions fluid. He was swept to the side, almost tilting off of his feet. Even suppressed by over 70%, the power rattled him, but he stuck his landing with a strong plant foot nonetheless, turning the block of his elbow into a tight grip of the tail, pinning it under his armor. Boom! Using it as leverage to throw Morvok's blow off balance, 2 palms met in the air. Rippling waves of green and violet peeled across the skies, lightning sparking and heavy clouds of sparkling amethyst spontaneously forming. The gazes met across the void and they separated, taking only a step back before they erupted. Chapter 1319. Emperor of Snakes. Their fists met, their tails swiping through the air and clapping against one another akin to thunder. Reeling back, they used those same tails as leverage, surging forward into the next confrontation even faster than the last. The platform was being destroyed tile by meticulously laid tile, the sky splitting beneath their might above. Silas stomped a foot, his body pivoting to the side as Morvok's fist suddenly became a blade in the form of a palm. The latter's claws extended, slicing through the air with a surge of poison. There was another pulse that came from Silas' eyes, and the runes of the poison collapsed. Ignoring the drain on his will and the pulse of pain that came from his pupils, he had already smoothly transitioned into his next attack. He erupted with an uppercut at Morvok's elbow, sending his armor swinging up and back. Taking advantage of the sudden opening in his chest, he kneed it, the wind splitting around it so fast it practically looked like a meteor breaking the atmosphere. Morvok's tail appeared in the way, his body leaping back and absorbing the blow. He seemed to have completely forgotten that he was battling an F-tier. The slit in his eyes carried a deathly murderous intent. He slid from one devious scheme and combo to the next, every one of his attacks hiding a vindictive cancer to it that, a single nick of which could kill a D-tier elephant. However, as cold and calculating as his eyes were, Silas seemed even more savage, his attacks more straightforward, more vindictive, so straight and to the point they should have been easy to read, and yet it felt like wading along a tightrope as sharks snapped at you from below. As soon as Morvok made some distance, his unobstructed arm pierced forward itself, forming another palm blade. This felt like the ability of the serpent armor. Everything became a fang, sharp and laced with poison. While the scorpion warlord armor could only emit its poison from its tail, the serpent warlord armor was far more flexible, and maybe that was why Morvok was so cocky about it. However, just when it seemed like Silas was about to receive an attack he had just seen, a sword suddenly appeared in Morvok's palm, the aura of the serpent warlord armor immediately extending over it. This was the first time Silas had ever seen the warlord armor cover anything but the human body. Even when he was fighting Castiel and the others, their weapons were just that. Weapons. They held them in their hands, but they didn't get the benefit of the armor. Well, they did, but only insofar as the strength changed to the wielders. This felt very different, though, and it was clear Morvok knew exactly that. Dripping in a violet aura, the blade appeared at Silas' throat in an instant of time. Silas hadn't even bothered to use his spatial and time runes in this battle. Against a rune master expert like Morvok, that would just be asking to be counted. But that didn't mean he couldn't use it at all. It just meant he had to choose the right time. Silas' eyes flickered and the runes on the tip of the sword dispersed once again, but Morvok seemed ready. He knew that whatever ability Silas was using to dispel his poison was very acute in range and had to be timed right. Otherwise, Morvok could just make more. However, there was another way to counter such a thing. Morvok's wrists twisted and suddenly his sword missed Silas' throat, extending beyond it. Hidden runes in the sword activated and its length increased several times over while Morvok's thrust became a slash. Bang! The poison-laced edge barely touched Silas' scorpion warlord armor, and yet it shattered it to pieces. It was so potent that even Silas' perfectly drawn runes couldn't hold up for more than a few split moments. And yet, the blade wasn't done, coming for Silas' neck even more swiftly. Silas' strength plummeted and his body seemed to lose all ability to react. Gasps rang out as the blade crossed his neck. But it somehow missed entirely. Morvok's eyes jumped. That was impossible. Silas didn't seem to think so, though. In fact, he had already taken a step forward, his scorpion warlord armor being redrawn in that split instant so fast that it reformed amidst the shattered emerald shards of the previous one. Primal Fury. Glassvolt Prism Arts. Silas' strength exploded. All of his fury seemed to pull into his armor, tainting his will and turning his bright emerald armor into a dark green that reflected scales so deep and blackened that he almost seemed to manifest Gogo's ancestor themselves. At the same time, his Glassvolt Prism Art turned the gauntlets of his scorpion warlord armor from incorporeal to very real, reflective glass sparking with bolts that raged through reality and fantasy like a temporal storm. And then his eyes flashed one last time. Right there, right where he was aiming, Morvok's so perfect armor was interrupted, its runes becoming disorganized and crumbling. Silas couldn't shatter the entire armor, but his comprehension of it through intuition was too strong, and his runeweaver profession had long reached the E grade. And he Was the Emperor of Snakes. Boom. The punch made the previous one look as though it had been thrown by a child. The world dimmed, all sense of ether vanishing as though a vacuum had been formed around it all. Morvok's torso shattered, an enormous hole appearing out of one side, making it look as though some enormous beast had bitten a chunk out of his body. And yet, the fist was so powerful there wasn't the slightest hint of blood, not the smallest touch of gore. Until Morvok fell to his knees, his beating heart thrumming beneath everyone's sight, just barely missed. Tauren Kael stood in the crowd, his eyes wide. The others of the ape lineage had gathered around him long ago, but no one seemed to have noticed that he had shown up for his appointment. Was he supposed to fight? That? Well, no one noticed his arrival but Silas alone, that is. In fact, his gaze had already landed on him. Chapter 1320, Help. Tauren felt his breathing hitch in his throat. His survival instinct seemed to kick in all on its own, his will flourishing and his body pulsing with radiant might that sent the other F-tiers around him sprawling. The powerful aura of a rampaging ape filled the skies, the howls that formed Tauren's fear taking physical form and shape as though he was being spurred on by something. Madness. Silas was looking right at him, threads of crimson streaming through his eyes as he unleashed his runeweaver eyes. Ever since Silas got his hands on this profession, he had learned to suppress it. His will was too powerful, and with his eyes becoming a new gateway to apply it to the world, its potency became too strong on a day-to-day basis. Even while it was suppressed, old Brahma thought him to be a charism. But now, he was unleashing it on purpose. As though the chains of his eyes had broken free completely, his will spilled out into the world in a torrent of his own rage and fury, suppressed emotions from these last several days rampaging out like stampeding war horses. And the one that felt the brunt of it was none other than Tauren. Silas had already seen the ape warlord armor in lesser forms twice now, and he could also feel that he was running out of time. His temper had snapped at him when he saw Morvok and he was taking action before he even truly felt it. This didn't surprise him. He was usually very good at controlling his emotions, but he was also very much human. Having already suppressed his demonic will once, there was no way it was going to continue to allow him to do so. If he tried to suppress it again, it would lash out. His demonic will hadn't bothered him since he handled the Grimblades and Lucius, and of course Ulrich and the situation with the level 30 bazaar. But that was also because nothing had infuriated him to this extent since then. Unfortunately, that left him in an awkward position. Could he still force Tauren to fight? Sure, but that wouldn't be nearly as productive as this. So, instead, he chose a completely different response. He wanted to see what Tauren was capable of, but there was no way he would dare to fight now, and there was also no way that Silas planned on explaining that he only defeated Morvok because of a trio of legendary professions he had. No one needed to know that. He was fine if they speculated, but the truth would be his and his alone. The underlying philosophy of the ape warlord armor was so tied to the berserk state that Silas felt that if he could forcefully induce it, though he would probably be doing Tauren a favor if he could pull himself out of it, Silas didn't care. What he wanted to see was this armor. This armor in its absolute strongest state. In that moment, Tauren actually broke through. From an armor drawn to essence mastery, he climbed up, touching the faintest edges of vitality mastery before firmly standing within it. He drew his armor in the state of absolute peril he felt, the primal urge deep within him bubbling forth in waves as his fist slammed down to the ground. The maw of his helm opened wide, his roar filling the air. He seemed to have pulled on every last shred of bravery he had in the depths of his soul, staring down Silas before he erupted with speed. In a single bound, his four limbs worked in unison, lasering through the air akin to a beam of crimson. Silas only reached out a palm. His shoulder shook as he snagged Tauren's neck out of the air, the latter's maw snapping at him but unable to close in the last of the distance. Looking him up and down, the weaving shades of green in Silas' eyes moved in relation to one another, pulsing and dancing until Chi. Tauren's armor collapsed. All at once, Tauren's momentum fell, the waves of fatigue hitting him in a torrent. Silas let him drop to the ground, taking a glance at the shuddering Morvok. The latter was bleeding out even now, but he was very much alive, and would surely live through this ordeal. Now, he had received what he wanted. He turned and left. Alex blinked when he saw this and then cleared his throat. Well, Ladies and gentlemen, show's over, it seems. If you're grateful for this once-in-a-lifetime experience you've been able to partake in, please feel free to make a donation. He pulled out a basket from who knows where. Don't be stingy, there's plenty of space. Come on, some of you C-tiers out there, I know you have quite a few D-tier ether stones burning a hole in your pockets you'll never use anyway. Yes, right this way. Khan blinked. You're back already. Yes. That was the only word Silas said as he returned to his hut and closed the door. Khan blinked again. Well, I hope that means you didn't get into much trouble, then. He was hoping that this probably meant that Silas hadn't managed to find a way onto the ape sanctum, and that made sense. You couldn't just leap from sanctum to sanctum just because you felt like it. Well, unless you were a true powerhouse, that is. But if Silas was that, he probably wouldn't have ended up in this situation in the first place. Maybe not, Khan thought to himself. Being a powerhouse in this place was, well, it didn't mean much at all to those people, now did it? There was another flash and Khan looked up to find that Grelith had returned. Oh, I sure am popular today. Look what the cat dragged in. Grelith didn't respond. His expression was just as unreadable as always, but there was something decidedly cold about his gaze. Has Silas awoken? Khan was about to respond when both of their heads snapped towards Silas' hut. A rampaging aura was emitting from it, rippling out in violent waves. This concludes the chapters for today. To continue the journey, be sure to find the next chapters on our channel. If you're excited about this story as we are, please like this video and subscribe. You can also leave a comment with your thoughts on this chapters.